So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for coming to today's 2017 Hisham Sharabi Memorial Lecture. I'm Samira Al-Qasim. I'm the program manager here at the Jerusalem Fund. It's a true pleasure and honor to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Edmund Ghareeb, who has been so valuable to our work at the Palestine Center. Over the years, he's brought an intellectual capital, moral gravitas, and a light touch influence without which our work here at the Palestine Center would be greatly impoverished. His contributions are very much in the spirit of the late Dr. Hisham Sharabi, who is the main architect of the Jerusalem Fund, and in whose name and legacy we are honoring today's lecture. So we must thank you, Dr. Ghareeb, for all that you have done for the Palestine Center over the years. Today, Dr. Ghareeb will discuss the contributions of early Arab American, quote-unquote, men of letters of the Mahjar press, which was the general name for the early Arabic language newspapers and publications in the United States, and which peaked from the 1890s to the 1920s. The thoughts of these Arab American writers shed interesting light on the perceptions and positions held within these communities on the issues of Palestine and Arab nationalism. One of the leading Arab and Arab American literary critics, novelists, poets, and short story writers was Mikhail Naimi. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that. In 1915, 2 years before the Balfour Declaration, Naimi warned about the dangers of establishing a Jewish state in Palestine. Years later, in the 1930s, Amin Mahmoud, another prominent writer, had a softer approach to Zionism as long as it was not state Zionism. Dr. Ghareeb will discuss these Mahjari writers, among others, to explore the evolution of thought with regard to one of the central issues at the heart of the 20th century Arab nationalism, which is the issue of Palestine. So now a little bit about Dr. Edmund Ghareeb, for those of you who don't know, and for those of you who do, let's have a refresher. He has a long and distinguished biography. He's an internationally recognized expert on the Middle East, Kurds, Iraq, and media issues. He was the first Mustafa Barzani Scholar of Global Kurdish Studies at American University's Center for Global Peace. And as mentioned, he served for over 15 years as a member of the Palestine Center Committee at the Jerusalem Fund, advising on programs and conferences. He taught at American University for 28 years, as well as at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. and Qatar, the University of Virginia, and George Washington University. Among his publications, he is the author of The Kurdish Nationalist Movement and the Kurdish Question in Iraq, and the co-author of War in the Gulf and the Historical Dictionary of Iraq. Dr. Ghareeb is also the editor of Split Vision, The Portrayal of Arabs in the American Media, which is the first book to explore how the American media covers Arabs and Arab affairs. We also know Dr. Ghareeb to be the translator and editor with Dr. Nasir Aruri, the late Dr. Nasir Aruri, of Enemy of the Sun, an anthology of modern Palestinian poetry, and he has written and lectured extensively on U.S. policy toward the Middle East, Iraq, the Kurds, and Gulf politics, U.S.-Arab relations, Arab Americans, the American media's coverage of the Middle East, and the information revolution in the Arab world. He also worked as a journalist for a number of years and has been interviewed widely by major American, Arab, European, and Asian media outlets. So please, let's give him a warm welcome.
Thank you, Samira, for that generous introduction. It is indeed humbling to hear all of that, but it's a pleasure to see you all here today. And the fact that there are people like you who are here, that shows that, in fact, you're really interested in the topic. You want to, because this is not a topic that too many people are either interested in or very knowledgeable about. It is really an honor and a privilege for me to give the Hisham Sharabi Memorial Lecture. I want to thank Dr. Subhi and the Board of Directors for asking me to give this lecture. Primarily for me, it's an important occasion because Hisham Sharabi was probably one of the most influential professors that I had during my studies at Georgetown. Probably he and Majid Khadouri were the most important influences during that period. Also because Hisham Sharabi has contributed so much to the study of Arab society and to offering new ideas on how to deal with the challenges facing Arab society, and also about his commitment, his long-term commitment to the Palestine question. Professor Sharabi was also, in addition to being a very much dedicated educator, an exacting professor, actually, and a very tough one. One time, one story apparently attributed to President Lincoln, to President Clinton, that one time he had one student who was giving a presentation, and the student went on to double the time that he was supposed to give the talk, and at the end of it, and Sharabi turned to him. He said, "If I used a gun, I would shoot you today." I don't know if how that the student from apparently was petrified, according to. But later on, he praised the presentation that he gave, but told him that he should be very exact, and the next time he gives a summation of which he used to do, by the way. This was something that every student in his classes, especially the two seminars that he offered, one on Arab society and the other one on European intellectual thought, and he or she had to read a book or a chapter and present a summary of it in about 8 minutes, maximum 10 minutes for the class. And every week we had to do that. So that was quite an interesting and important process, which helped us learn a great deal, especially on topics that were very complex and difficult to deal with. But Hisham Sharabi was also, as I said, in addition to being a researcher, a scholar, an educator, he was also an institution builder, as we heard from Samira. Ralph Waldo Emerson said once, "An institution is the lengthened shadow of a man." And all of us here know that we are actually sitting in the shadow of Hisham Sharabi's contributions, because he was, as Samira said, the architect of the Jerusalem Fund, established with some of his friends, and he established the Jerusalem Fund and the Palestine Center. He also was one of the founders of the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown University. He also was a founder of one of the founders of the Arab American University Graduates Association, and he established the Journal of Palestine Studies at the Institute of Palestine Study in Beirut, which has moved in recent years to Washington, and is one of the best and the most scholarly journals about dealing with the Middle East and the Palestinian issue in particular. Hisham also was one of the intellectuals who focused his study on Arab society. And actually we have another great scholar here who has done and contributed a great deal to the study of Arab society, Professor Helene Barakat. And they both sometimes worked together, but generally he focused on the issue of Arab society, and later on patriarchal or neo-patriarchy, as he called it, and the role of the father. And here we're talking about the father or the patriarch, both symbolically as well as in terms of political authority. And he felt that this authority of the patriarch has to be undermined, has to be overthrown, if Arab society is going to advance and overcome the challenges that it has faced. He believed that Patriarchy Act was actually one of the causes for the defeat of the Arabs. Among his many contributions in this area, for example, he was one of the leaders in focusing serious intellectual analysis and critique on the challenges facing Arab society. He later carried this work actually further by talking about the issues of modernity and how modernity is to be achieved. He believed that intellectuals have a unique role in transforming the social consciousness without which there cannot be any meaningful change. For the change to occur, he believed that there has to be a change in the language, change in the discourse, in the narrative, in the vocabulary for that to occur. Because unless there is a change in the language and in the vocabulary, we are not likely to see a change in consciousness. He believed that a change in self-awareness and consciousness is essential to bring about any change. And so he believed that language must be used to bring self-awareness and free dialogue was essential to reach new levels of understanding. He also believed that the liberation of women is essential in awakening and empowering not just women, but the whole society. Unless you empower women, you cannot empower the society. Modernity is essential and can only be reached by breaking the ties clearly with the past and bringing forth a new renaissance, which would basically be focused and rely extensively on secularism and rational thought. Hisham Sharabi, the critic, the intellectual, the human being, in essence, argued that there can be no change or liberation without removing the patriarch, both as a symbol and as authority, and without liberating women in word and deed. I actually first met Hisham Sharabi through a friend of mine, Dr. Amin Mahmoud, who was a student at the time. He later became a prominent academic in Jordan and Kuwait, established several colleges and universities, and became a Jordanian minister several times. He was a student of Hisham, and he was also a friend of Hisham. But during the first year, I didn't really get a chance to know Hisham. I didn't know him until we went to begin to know him until we got to Beirut, where I took a job and decided to take some courses at AUB at that time, and took a job as a journalist with the Beirut Daily Star. It was during this period that my relationship with Hisham began to develop, and we used to meet often at his house or at cafes, some of the cafes, and often talked about the political situation in the region. He also later would ask me when he started the Palestine Journal, he asked me to be the assistant editor for the journal. And when I suggested that we interview a prominent Arab figure for the first article and the first issue, he said, "Who do you recommend?" And I said, "Muhammad Hassanein Haikal." And so he said, "Fine, go ahead and do it." So I went to Egypt, interviewed Haikal, and he gave a fascinating interview. It's the first article in the first issue of the journal, and he did a number of interviews later. One of the most interesting interviews actually was one that unfortunately I made the mistake of turning the tape too early, or maybe he may not have allowed it, was an interview that he and I did with Dr. George Habashi, who was the head of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Well, first of all, it was very difficult to get there. After we arranged it, they told us, "Come at 12 o'clock to such and such address." We went there, we had coffee, and then they said, "No, he's going to be someplace else." And on the way, they changed directions again, and they gave us another place to go to. So by the time we got there, it was something like 1:30. When we got there, they had food on the table. He came about 10 minutes later, and we had simple dish, and then we sat down, started talking. He let me do most of the questions, but as soon as we stopped, I turned the interview, I turned the tape off, and he and Habash got into a very interesting debate and discussion about Marxism, the influence of Marxism, and why did the Arab national movement of Habash end up becoming Marxist oriented, which was quite interesting because Hisham himself has shifted from the PPS, although he continued to admire that is the PPS is the Syrian social nationalist movement earlier, and he had shifted from that party, although he continued to have a great deal of admiration for its founder and leader, and he later would reread his work, and that's, by the way, I'm talking here about Anton Sada, the founder of the party, who was executed in Beirut in 1949. And he had himself began to focus on Marx and his influence. Although he had touched upon him, he had been studying and teaching some of his writings and his thinking at Georgetown for the seminar on European political thought. But that was one of the most interesting discussions that I ever witnessed, and I really regret I should have just turned the tape recorder on, because I don't think there was a record of that. Although the discussion and the answers that we focused on during that interview was about Habash's interpretation and explanation for what happened in Jordan in 1970-71. And he offered one of the best analyses of what went wrong, especially within the ranks of the Palestinian movement. So we did a number of these, and later when I became interested after I returned to the US, took his course مقدمات or لدراسة المجتمع العربي, which later became a book. He thanked the students. There were several Arab students who were in that class, and he actually thanked them by name in the introduction to that book. And that was one of the major works that moved Hisham and began to push him in a different direction. And it was in that course that actually he began to focus on this issue of Arab society and the challenges facing Arab society and how to deal with it and get out of it. The idea of working on this article, by the way, this is based on an article that I did with a friend and a colleague who happens to be here today, Dr. Gianetti Tingy. We worked on how the Mahjar press and Arab writers, American writers, dealt with the Palestine issue. Well, the story really began, it started with my finding an article, clipping actually, of falling apart in a book actually it wasn't a book, it's a copy of the Al-Funun journal, which was one of the early journals published by Arab American writers in the second decade of the 20th century. And almost all the prominent writers, later people who formed the Pen League or Rabit al-Qalamiyya, were members and contributed to it, and later on emerged as some of the major writers, both in the Arab world and some even in the United States, people such as Khalid Gibran, Mikhail Naimi, Amin Rihani, Habib Katibi, Abdul Masih Haddad, Iliya Abu Madi, and many, many other writers. This article had the name of Mikhail Naimi, but it didn't say when, where, or when was it written. I mean, I was familiar with Naimi's writings, but I searched and searched, couldn't find a reference to it. The article was warning about the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine. And it was amazing that it was during, later on I would find that this was, as Samira mentioned, this was published in 1915, 2 years before the Balfour Declaration. After a long search, I asked people at the Library of Congress, I asked people at Georgetown, I asked people who were much more knowledgeable about Naimi's writings, and nobody made a reference to it. Nobody was aware of it. And even Hisham never mentioned it, even though that's another reason why I decided to do this talk, this presentation, is because Hisham, as a young man, considered Mikhail Naimi as his spiritual teacher, although later he would move in a different intellectual, on a different intellectual path. And what was the final thing that basically I asked a former librarian at the Library of Congress, George Dimitri Salim, who had, he's an Egyptian of Lebanese origin, and he translated Elia Abu Madi, was very familiar with the Arab American literature, and he said, look, you can either get yourself a couple of interns, have them spend a couple of months looking at the newspapers published at that time in which Naimi wrote, or there's only one other place I can suggest, and this is an unpublished manuscript about the writings of Arab American writers and the newspapers in which they wrote. And that was written by Henry Milke. So I went, and in fact, that's where I found, there was reference to that article there. And the article apparently was published in one of the major newspapers, Arabic language newspapers at that time. It was Mir'at al-Gharb, the Mirror of the West. And as I mentioned, it was 1915. But what was also unusual about it is that Mikhail Naimi is not known for his political writings at all. Except for a few anti-war writings that he published during the First World War. He served in the military. He was not interested in politics. The only other time I can think about that he basically paid attention or participated even in political activities, and it wasn't really political, but it did have a political dimension, was when he was part of a group which tried to collect money to help the starving people in Lebanon and Syria during the First World War. As far as I know, these were the only 2 times that Naimi ever expressed or showed interest in politics. Naimi was actually a literary critic. He was a novelist, short story writer. He was very well known as for his short stories about Arab American immigrants, but he also was devoted to the unity of faith. He believed that all religions, that God created all religions to help people reach the same path. And he said that you can be either an eagle who can fly to the top of the mountain very quickly, or you can be a turtle, and it would take you many, many days perhaps to get to the top of the mountain. But he believed that was all the same path. He was very much influenced by the writings of Zen Buddhists, by Taoism, by Buddhism, and of course by Islamic and Christian mystics. But he also, what's unusual about him is that he had studied at a school organized by the Russian Imperial Society for basically, it opened schools for Orthodox Christians in Lebanon, Syria, and Palestine. The regional center was in Nazareth. He did very well in his village of Biskinta, and he ended up being sent to study in Nazareth, and later he was selected because he did very well in Nazareth to study in Russia, where he became very much influenced by the writings of people such as Pushkin, Tolstoy, Chekhov, Dostoevsky, and many other writers. But other than, as I said, other than his anti-war poems, he didn't have any interest in politics. In this article, Naimi basically asks. He started with reference to an article that was published in the Hebrew Standard in London, and which basically was referring about growing support for the Zionist movement in Britain and in Europe. So he starts his article by saying, in whose brain was this idea born and matured? Was it born, did it mature, and then spread like lightning from east to west and north to south? I do not know, and I do not care to know. This war, that's World War I, has filled this earth with prophets and interpreters of dreams. However, the prophets of independence for the Israelites and for their return to the land of their forefathers immediately found thousands, or rather millions, of followers among the Hebrews and among others as well, because their prophecies in some evoke religious feelings and bring political and economic benefit to others. Some religious Jews saw a vision of Zion rising above the trenches, crowned with glory, with the glory of David and Solomon, and built by the angels. Naimi goes on to say, it is unfortunate that some Christians, followers of the Nazarene, turned their back on his teachings, or if they are separated from the Old Testament. And if you say to them, Jesus didn't come to fulfill this or that prophecy, but to pour new wine in a new vessel, and to bring relief to the weary and those laden with heavy burdens, they are likely to give a literal interpretation because they see in the Bible only its dead letters, and therefore they rush to interpret this or that incident according to this or that prophecy. Naimi points out that Jewish opinion was not unanimous. He also showed sympathy and understanding for the persecution suffered by Jews in a number of countries. He adds that there are other Jews who say Washington is our Zion and prefer to stay where they are. However, many see in the promulgation of the Jewish state a solution for the political, economic, and social problems that they face. If one thinks of what Jews had to cope with, he says, including the mocking and derision and persecution, one will not blame them if they use all the means at their disposal to live in a country over which they are sovereign and where they will not shy from proclaiming their religion and their identity. He also then goes on to criticize the British and other governments which seem to be willing to support such ideas. He says, some kingdoms of this earth saw that it is in their interest to make Palestine a Jewish state. This idea was well received, as though Palestine was an empty land, devoid of inhabitants, and all that was required to turn it into an independent state was to transport a few thousand Jews and establish a state and tell them, till this land and enjoy its fruits and multiply like the sands of the sea. However, he says, there are 1 million human beings in Palestine who were born and grew up there. They buried their grandfathers and great-grandfathers in its soil and call it their homeland. They have nowhere else to rest their heads except in this small plot of land. By what right does an Englishman or some other bring a Jew to the natives of Palestine and tell them that the forefathers of this man used to live in this land 2,000 years ago, and that it is his land which he has inherited from his forefathers. As for you, you go and look for some other land. Is it not strange, he says, that England, which claims to have unsheathed its sword in the defense of liberty and the rights of the weak, is capable now of committing the sin of selling 1 million human beings with their property and their livelihood into slavery? Naimi concludes by leveling sharp criticism at the leaders and peoples of the region for remaining quiet and not raising their voice in protest. He says, after saying the above, and the article is much longer, but I've just used some segments of it. After saying the above, I ask myself, why should we blame England if it chooses to give Palestine to the Jews, not having heard a single word of protest and complaint from the people who call Palestine their home and their land? And so to a certain extent, this was almost, as I said, a prophetic article and warning that apparently not many paid attention to. This indicates that actually gives us an idea about the role that the Arab American press played at that time. Many Arab Americans in their newspapers tended to identify with the issue of Palestine, which they considered to be southern Syria for many of them, and to whose defense they came as Syrian and later some of them as Arab nationalists. The issuance of the Balfour Declaration and the mandate granted the League of Nations to Britain over Palestine. And there was what we began to see, some protests as well as some activities. And the press was the voice of many of these activists who were concerned about these issues. The Arabic language press in the US emerged almost immediately within a decade or so of the beginning of the arrival of immigrants, mostly from Lebanon and Syria, some from Palestine, some from Iraq, later some from Yemen. They began to arrive in the United States. In its heyday, the Arab American press, and I would say the first newspaper was published in 1892. In fact, the immigrants started establishing newspapers in many places before they started building their mosques and churches, which were actually also among the first institutions or buildings that they would establish. There were something close to 80 newspapers published in the United States from 1892, when Kawkab America, the American star, or the American planet actually more accurately, was established by the Arbili brothers, who were Syrians. Arbili, one of them, the father was a doctor and a professor at the American University of Beirut, and they were the first family to immigrate together to the United States. And they supported actually the Ottoman government at the time. But they also opened their pages, the pages of their newspapers, to voices which were, I don't want to say at least in the beginning that were critical, but at least which began to raise questions about the Ottoman government and the way it was ruling in Arab land. Some of these papers lasted only a few weeks or a few months. Some lasted many years. Some, such as AlHuda, which was established by the Nahum and Salloum Mukarzal, was the second oldest Arabic language newspaper anywhere until it expired in around 1991. So this paper was phenomenal when you think of it. And it attracted many of the best writers, the Arab American writers. It also was the newspaper which served as a school for Afifa Karam, one of the first feminists who established one of the first magazines, women's magazines in the United States. And only at that time there were only 3 magazines which were at least interested or dealing with women's issues in the Arab world. So she started one in the in the United States, and she started her education, her journalistic education, with AlHuda. The press basically launched a revolution, this press, in literary form, and it also started many cultural movements that were imitated by many in the Arab world. The press served several ends for its readers. One of them was, of course, to educate many of its readers who didn't even know Arabic. Some did. They didn't know English, and some didn't even know Arabic. To basically learn about their new country, about its system of government, its politics. The papers also kept the immigrants informed of what was going on back home. One of the unfortunate or the negative angles of this press was that it at times carried with it the problems of the old country, as they used to call it. Basically sectarianism, regionalism, ethnic divisions sometimes. Nevertheless, they also were able to rise above these divisions when they were challenged. For example, around the first decade, around 1908, 1909, the U.S. Department of Immigration basically considered the Syrians to be a non-white Asian people, Asian race, and banned them. They wanted to ban immigration from coming to the United States. And the community as a whole, and all the newspapers, all the editors of the newspapers started the first lobby, you can call it the first lobby in a way, in the United States to influence the U.S. government. Took a few years, but ultimately they succeeded in reversing that decision. And they also, one of the newspapers played a very important role as well in supporting the nationalist causes later on in the Arab world, first against the Ottomans and later against the British and the French. They showed a great deal of sympathy for the Egyptian revolutionaries, for the Moroccan revolutionaries, for the Tunisians, for the Yemenis, for Iraqis, and of course for the Palestinian cause. Many of them, in fact, they sent the first Arab Congress, which was held in Paris in 1913, saw two editors, Najib Diab, who, by the way, had been condemned to death by the Ottoman government and had to flee the country for his life, and later he became an editor of Kawkab America, and after that he started his own newspaper, Mar'at al-Gharb. And Naum Mukarzal, who was the editor of AlHuda, made it to the Arab Congress in Paris and participated. Amin Rihani was also involved in this movement. But it was actually the Balfour Declaration which really began to awaken the Arab American community, or at least I shouldn't. This would be actually strong to say the Arab American community, but I would say some of the elites within the Arab American community, some of the people who were politically conscious and were well educated, people such as Amin al-Rihani. Amin al-Rihani was a great writer, one of the Arab American Mahjar. He showed a great deal of knowledge. He translated Al-Ma'arri's, the quatrains of Al-Ma'arri in 1903. So you can imagine, and he had also an excellent command of the English language. He went with a troupe playing Shakespeare from city to city in the United States. He played Hamlet sometimes Macbeth, which actually even served to get him much more involved, much more knowledgeable about American and English, but not only the command of the language, but about the country. And when the company split up, he returned to New York, and he actually wrote the first Arab American novel, the Book of Khalid, in which he talked about how Arab Americans were becoming aware of the political environment in the United States at that time, and how he was actually recruited by one of the parties to try to get Arab Americans to vote at that time. It's actually not only just one of the first, it's not only the first Arab American novel, it's one of the first novels written by immigrants, as far as I know, in the United States. Not the first, but I think it's one of the first. But basically it was what was happening in Palestine that galvanized the community and began to show a great deal of activism. There was actually an organization that was started, although in reality it was, they published a booklet in 1921, but in reality I don't think it was organized officially until 1923. It was called the Arab National League, and Fuad Shatara was involved in it, Habib Kadbi was involved in it, and these people began to publish, not only for the Arab American community, to publish articles about what was going on in the Middle East, and specifically with the Palestine issue, with the threat of the displacement of the Palestinian people, but also they began to try to communicate with the American people as well. They tried to publish articles in English, books, pamphlets, and some of them would ultimately also, like Hani, would go from city to city giving lectures and interviews in the United States talking about the Palestinian issue. There were also people who came from the Arab world and from Palestine to try to raise the awareness also among the Americans, and who were welcomed and by the Arab American community. These people included people such as Hani Abdel Hadi, the president of the Jerusalem Bar Association and secretary of the Palestine Arab Executive. Also Jamal Husseini, who was the honorary secretary of the Arab Executive. Abdul Hamid Shuman, who later was an immigrant, but he went back and later would establish the Arab Bank. They also played an important role, contributed articles to a publication that was published in 1932 dealing with the issue of Palestine, and which included also people who basically people who supported the Zionist movement and people who were against it. Hani, as I said, was really probably the most influential and the most effective in talking about this issue. He argued that the Zionist state was not necessary. He repeatedly called for Arab-Jewish cooperation and coexistence. In an undated article in the same compilation that I had mentioned, he wrote an article called Life Between Two Peoples. He wrote that there is a need for the Arabs and Jews to cooperate, and that now the Jews have their own land, they have their farms, they have their businesses, they have their schools, they can learn and speak their languages. They don't need to create a state of their own. And he continued to write articles which basically tried to focus on cooperation, to try to influence American Jews who were at least who are not Zionists, that perhaps cooperation is possible. Another person who worked in this area was Fuad Shatara. He wrote letters to Albert Einstein. He received actually one answer from him, at least once that I know of, and where he basically said that it would be better to work together. And so did Yehuda Magnus, who was the president of the University of Jerusalem, Jerusalem University, Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And there was also, he wrote an article in a book that was later would be compiled by his brother called The Fate of Palestine. Rihani wrote, "I say that political Zionism is the only barrier between the Arabs and the Jews. Remove that barrier and the Palestinian problem will be solved to the interest and satisfaction of everyone concerned. Remove that barrier and the doors of Arabia will be open to the Jews who are fleeing today from the persecution of the culture lords of Europe. Remove that barrier and the cooperation of the Jews and the Arabs in Palestine will awaken a new spirit of progress and light." So basically he was trying to urge people not to create a state, but he said Arabs would be welcoming the Jews to live in Palestine as their home. There were also a number of others who later would play a very important role. One of them was Jorge Ayala. He established a very important magazine. I wish we had time to talk about it, and we don't. We're coming to the end of my time here. But he established a well-written journal, which is quarterly, actually. It used to come out once every 3 months, and had contributions from some of the best educated Arab Americans, as well as from Arab diplomats, as well as from prominent Jewish American activists who are opposed to Zionism, as well as some a couple of times some American senators who contributed to articles to the journal. And one of the issues that they focused on, of course, they didn't just focus on the Palestine issue, but the Palestine issue was a very important part of that journal's work. You also had people such as Philip Petit, who was not, again, that involved politically. He was one of the pioneers of Arabic studies in the United States at Princeton University. He gave a testimony along with Faris Malouf in 1944, opposing the idea of partitioning Palestine and creating a Jewish state in Palestine. Very eloquent presentation. They said that the British should give London, one of them, but I think it was Faris Malouf, they should give London instead of Palestine to the Jews to establish their own state. Well, let me stop here. I think I'm coming to the end of my talk, so we'll see if you have any comments or questions.
My understanding that in the lands of Greater Syria under the Ottomans, there was very little education available other than what, like Protestant missionaries, or you mentioned the Russian Orthodox Church, or the Tsar at least, et cetera, provided. So you had all these newspapers starting, but didn't you have quite a few immigrants who were illiterate in Arabic? Forget English, they were illiterate in Arabic. So where did they find this readership for so many newspapers? And second, just a quick second question. Since the early immigrants were generally from minority groups, you also had a lot of Jewish immigrants from the lands of Syria, et cetera. Before the Balfour Declaration, was there any participation by Jewish Arab intellectuals in these circles?
Both are great questions. First of all, I think many of these people who came, who really arose as the leaders, intellectual leaders, many of them did not receive university degrees, but they were educated. They were well-read. They had been taught either in local schools, in religious schools, the Maronite churches. There were also French and Italian missionaries who also opened schools. And most of the people who went to those schools were usually, but not always, or only, Catholics or Maronites. There were Muslims who went, there were Orthodox who went to these schools. There were, as you pointed out, American Protestant missionaries. In fact, one of the amazing things about the United States, one of the reasons why a lot of people began to come to the United States is because of the image that many immigrants, by the way, this was during the Civil War. There was a decision that was taken by President Lincoln to give free land to farmers. What was it called? There was a name.
Homestead Act.
Homestead Act. Thank you. The Homestead Act, I think it was in the middle 1860s. Well, people in the Middle East began to hear about it by the 70s, early 70s. It took about 10, 15 years to get there, that the King of America was giving free land to farmers, to peasants. And so that was one reason why, if you go take a look at the people, the background of the people who came at that time, many of them came from the small villages. They were from farming villages, peasants, and not really many of them were not well educated, but they were adventurous and they wanted to have a better life. They were also living under an oppressive government, and for that reason they decided to come here. But the second thing had to do with those missionary schools. In fact, when the King Crane Commission was sent by President Wilson and to find out what is it that the people of the region wanted to have, because the British and the French wanted to have mandatory power over Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, and other parts of the region, while the people, many of them were not interested in that. So Wilson, with his 14-point plans, decided to send the King Crane Commission, and people met. They went there and interviewed religious leaders, political leaders, academics, prominent figures in the community, Mukhtars, etc. And they came back basically saying that the people told them, we want to be independent. We don't want British mandate or a French mandate. But if we have to have a French a mandate, we want America to be the mandatory power. And when they asked them, why would you want America to be they said, because America is a great country, a country that has brought us schools and educate, because in fact, many universities, many elementary and secondary schools were opened by American missionaries, all the way from Iraq through southern Turkey, to Syria, to Palestine, to Lebanon. And so people had a positive image of Americans, both as educators and also especially the doctors who went there. So that gave them
It was not occupational power.
And absolutely, and that's it. They didn't have a colonial legacy. You're absolutely right. What was the second?
Jewish intellectuals from
Okay,
Syria.
yes, that's another.
Were they part of these salons and this
Some were,
intellectual
actually some were. As late as 1930, there was an organization called the Israelite, American Israelites. And this was an organization that was founded in New York by Jews who came from the Arab world, mostly Syria, Lebanon, Palestine. There were a couple of them from Palestine, some from Egypt. And they put an ad for their organization among the ads of other Arab American organizations as late as 1930. Because I have a copy of that book. It's called the Syrian American Almanac. And you'll find the names of several of those Jewish individuals who were very active and thought of themselves as part of the community. And so, yes, there were, but and in fact, for a long time, many Jews wanted to stay. They didn't want to leave. Some places they were forced to leave. Look what happened, both sometimes by what the Zionist movement did, and times also by what the governments, the Arab governments did.
Dr. Ghareeb, I have a question. So you mentioned Rouhani had taken a softer approach to Zionism and argued mainly against the state itself. So obviously they didn't take his advice, but how was it received? How was his argument received at the time?
Well, basically, at the time, this argument was mainly in the United States, and many of the people, so there were some criticisms, actually. But he was getting criticism, by the way, from the Zionist community. He was attacked, especially when he was doing debates with some leaders of the Jewish community on radio at that time or in the newspapers, and you began to hear for the first time a language similar to the language we hear now about Arabs and Muslims, about being rapists and lawless attackers by the at that time by the mayor in New York. So he was attacked, but he was also criticized sometime from the other side by some Arab nationalists who felt that he was giving or he was making like a concession to the Zionists. Although what he emphasized, what he tried to, he wanted to have a, he believed that Arabs and Jews could live together in one state, but that there should be no partition, there should be no Israeli state.
Yeah, I was wondering, in these newspapers, where Islam fit in. You mentioned secularism was a very strong current among the community, which was, of course, not just Muslim. But were there interesting efforts to actually work from within some Islamic tradition to, to see it positively and kind of evolve in an evolving way, or is it basically we don't do religion like that here?
No, actually, in fact, if you take a look at some of the newspapers and some of the writers, people like Rehani was, in fact, called for close cooperation, emphasized that Arab culture, that he himself was a Maronite, although he didn't believe, he was not a true believer or a devoted believer, let me put it that way. But he believed that he was his culture was the Arab culture, Islamic culture. He was part of that culture, and he actually was one of the great travel writers. He went to Arabia. He met with all the leaders of Arabia, and he, a Maronite Christian, actually tried to mediate between Sharif Hussein and Abdulaziz Al Saud. He traveled to Yemen, where at one meeting they asked him when he was introduced, Amin Rehani, apparently in Yemen there are families who are Sayyids, and so he was asked if he was a Hassani or Husseini. That means he belonged to the family of the sons of Hassan, the son of Ali, or Hussein, who was the son of Ali. There were also somebody like George Khairallah. Actually, George Khairallah took the name of, he's named his son Ali, and he became known as Abu Ali Khairallah, although as you can see from his name was George. He was a Christian name. And if you take a look at his writings and his works, you'll find that he, for example, he wrote a number of articles. I remember now one comes to my mind about Al-Qarawiyyin University in Morocco, which is one of the first universities in the world. And he said many of the traditions, in fact, the robe and the hat that you have are basically that they used in Europe came from the Qarawiyyin University there. And he talked about the great role of Muslim scholars gave to people and to the world, actually. And they translated a great deal of the works also of early Islamic Arabic scholars. I mean, when I'm talking about early, I'm talking going back to people like Al-Mutanabbi al-Mawardi and people, religious scholars as well as poets and other writers. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't have a question, but I have a story I'd like to share about Dr. Sharabi.
Please.
It's not working. Can you hear me? Hear me? Oh, okay. Yeah. When I was working for Middle East Broadcasting Center, MBC, I was also contributing to CNN World Report, and we did a special program about the issue of water resources in the Middle East and how it impacted the Arab-Israeli conflict. And so a group of Arab journalists from Egypt, Lebanon, myself from the U.S., agree on a segment, and I started the segment by talking about the Israeli diversion of the Jordan River from the Golan into the Nakab, and how this was, the setting for the 1967 war. So anyway, there was two Israeli who wrote to the program saying, "Oh, how you allow such kind of Arab propaganda to be on the air on CNN?" So I went to Dr. Hisham Sharabi and I explained to him what happened, And I said, can you please write a response? And he said, absolutely, I will. So he asked me to give him some outline of, what was the debate, what was the issue, and he wrote fantastic letter telling them that this was the correct historic analysis of what happened, and this is the reason, and so forth. And I also went to Khalil Jahshan, who wrote a similar letter, and I forced CNN to actually air these two letters as they did air the letters who were counter. So Dr. Sharabi, God bless his soul, is a fantastic man.
Well, you and he were part of that great tradition of Arab American writers who really made a difference, or tried to make a difference anyway. Yeah. Yeah.
I have a few things to mention about. First of all, thanks for the presentation. I really enjoyed it. It's so informative, and I think I have so many questions beyond this meeting that I need to know from you, especially about the book of Khalid, if you have the Arab version. Do you have it? Do you have the Arabic version of the book of Khalid?
I don't have the Arabic. I have. He wrote it in English, by the way, and it was translated.
Translated,
later to
yeah.
Arabic. Yeah.
Yeah. About the Arab influence in the early 20s in regard of the to be considered white. I think I laughed when you said that, because now the Arabs are fighting to not to be considered white in America. So they were like kind of part of this kind of unlikely things that we're having right now. And the other thing is about the your meeting with Habash. What year this happened? I mean,
This is, I think, either around 1971, late 1971, early 1972.
71, 72. This is like right after
Yeah,
after their exile from
the civil or the war of 1970.
Aylul al-Aswad.
No, was it Black September?
Yeah, Aylul
Yes,
al-Aswad,
it was
no.
Black September.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
It was actually the last Palestinian forces were expelled from Jordan in it was in 1971. They were still, some of them were near the border between when you go beyond Jerash, the mountainous area near the Syrian-Jordanian border. And that was it. And that's when they moved from there to Lebanon.
And my other question is about the first issue of Palestine Journal of Palestine Studies. Is that when it was in Lebanon, it came in Arabic or in English?
There was another journal that was in
Yeah.
Arabic, مجلة الدراسات الفلسطينية, which was edited by Sayegh, Anis, not
Yeah.
Anis. Yes.
Yeah, Anis
Anis
Sayegh and
Sayegh,
Salim
Anis Sayegh.
Tamari are still.
Who was the brother of another, by the way. Later on, one of the Sayeghs was one of the most eloquent, most articulate defenders of the Palestine cause in the United States, Faiz Sayegh. I don't know if any of you remember him. This guy had a TV interview one time with David Susskind, and Susskind tried to undermine his argument, but he wiped the floor with Susskind and for all, and that's it. And even when he was interviewed by Bill Buckley, who is a very eloquent, very articulate, knowledgeable person, regardless of whether you agree or disagree with his views, Buckley had trouble arguing with Faiz Sayegh. I mean, his command of the facts was unbelievable. There was nobody like him. I don't know anyone like him. He was very articulate, very knowledgeable. By the way, he's also one of the few people that I know who have always spoke in classical Arabic. He wouldn't speak in dialect. He always spoke in classical Arabic. To me, that was amazing. The first time I heard him, I met him, but yes, there were many people who later would play a role. But I think that situation, also the political situation on the ground, was different during this period. and what I'm saying is that there were also major disagreements among the communities here, at least some of the communities. When you think of it, some of them were like AlHuda was a Maronite newspaper, spoke for the Maronite community. Al-Bayan spoke for the Muslim and the Druze, sometimes for the Druze community earlier. Also, Mir'at al-Gharb and Al-Nisr, these are two newspapers, more or less, they spoke for the Pan-Arabists, but for the Orthodox community, Christian community as well. There were later people like who, and by the way, although it's true that the majority of the early immigrants were Christian, there were still substantive number of Muslims who came to this country. Some of them went to Massachusetts, some went to Iowa, and
was built in North Dakota.
North Dakota, absolutely. North Dakota is, because I went to Cedar Rapids one time. They had a mosque that's, I don't know, I think that was built in the early years of the 20th century. I don't know if anybody, so you had people, and you didn't have, at least at that time, that kind of sectarian, well, it did exist to a certain extent, but it didn't have the aspect that we are seeing it does, this extremist, tone that you find now.
I followed, by the way, your recommendation, and I read the book America by Rabia.
What did you think of it?
It's an amazing, if you want to know the history of the Arabs and their arriving to America, it's one of the wonderful basic reading for us. It's amazing book.
Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it. I enjoyed it when I read it and learned a lot from it as well. This is a novel, by the way, about a woman immigrant. America, it's called America. Rabia Jaber.
Lebanese.
Okay. Yeah. Yes, and then
those 18, I mean, it's a little bit technical and historical, documenting it is. All these 18 newspapers with the copies and everything, it's like preserved. You have it. I mean, somebody, not you, I mean, personally, we, let's say, we have it somewhere.
some of them are there. Some are at the Library of Congress, thanks to the work of George Atiyah, who was the librarian for the Middle East section of the Library of Congress. And by the way, he and Sharabi were at one time members of the PBS. They worked closely together in a publication called Al-Jil Al-Jadid, which is actually was very intellectual, very philosophical, and brought a lot of that's what made in part the PBS at that time so popular among well-educated people and among intellectuals. But some are also available at the New York Public Library.
Okay.
But not, unfortunately, not all of them.
They're cataloged probably, right?
Yes, but some are actually, I went one time to the Library of Congress, there are some actual copies, but I think they
Digitalized.
But unfortunately, some of them are gone or lost. And that's why, actually, that's what's happening. And the other unfortunate thing that has happened also is that you had, I don't know how many of you know, for example, that there were a number of books that were published in Arabic, hundreds of books that were published in Arabic in the United States. And these included historical works, they included novels, they included short stories, they included poetry, they included zajal. Like, that's something amazing. The zajal is the folk poetry, and and this is unfortunately this is not well preserved. I asked people at the Library of Congress if they had copies of. They didn't. They had only one. There were several of them, and some of them were quite good. So it's very unfortunate. That's why, like the old generation apparently passed away, and the children didn't know the language, and they just tossed it.
The other question related to the same thing, because it's about the memory of these things. It's like, first, their families. I know, Rihani family, they're doing something. The other families are doing anything, or the organization did anything to preserve their heritage?
Some tried. For example, I know that Elia Abu Madi's son was trying to, by the way, Elia Abu Madi is one of the great, not just Arab American, but one of the great Arab poets of the 20th century. And also an editor of Samir magazine. His son tried to get, I don't know, to get it to some universities. Do you know anything about what happened? No. But I don't know what has happened because he had a treasure. I mean, what Robert
Abu Madi.
he had a treasure, and I hope somebody either got it recently because I know as of a few years ago still it didn't go anyplace, but I hope they find a home for it because this is really would be extremely valuable. It's not just because of his father's writings, but for the letters and also because of the copies. And there was also another journal that was in English, by the way, older than the Arab world, which was published by Saloum Mukarza. And it was a superb magazine in the 1920s, and it lasted until the 1930s. But that one, I think it's the Library of Congress has them, and I think the family, a descendant, one of the, Helene Samhan was the descendant of one of the,
Helene
who used to be with the ABC,
Yeah.
Saloum Mukarza is her great-grandfather, I think.
So they are the
grandfather.
family that they have AlHuda too, right?
Yes, absolutely. Nahum, it was Nahum. Now, by the way, this is, I know you have a question or comment.
Sorry about that.
And then we'll stop. But one of the things that's also very interesting, people don't realize, the Arab press in America was very much influenced by the technological revolution that was taking place. So there was now Saloum Mukarza invented a linotype machine that made it easier and simpler to print Arabic newspapers and magazines. And that technology later on was imported into the Arab world. Al-Ahram used one of the linotype machines, and so there was also another angle in addition to the way the Arab press also influenced the Arabic language press there in the way they began to cover stories, to use, for example, photos, to have headlines, and they also, some of them, like AlHuda, like Marat al-Gharb, had correspondence. Some of them, Huda had them in Venezuela, in Brazil, in Australia, in Damascus. Kawkaba America had them in Istanbul, Damascus, Cairo. And so when you think of it in those days, that's amazing. Yeah.
I just wondered if there's a TV program or a documentary that would be at that level about Arab Americans that could, you could imagine coming on PBS and a whole lot of people's consciousness is raised in a very positive way.
Unfortunately not. There are some actually documentaries on Arab American immigration. When did they come here? For example, I did one and I found out something later. I did with the Voice of America, and then I found out later that most of the tapes they had, they threw them away when they started Al-Hurra. But there are, Al-Hurra did also a documentary. I think there were some other Arabic language channels, including Al Jazeera, I think at one time did a short documentary, and they interviewed some Arab Americans. But unfortunately, I don't think there is really a very good record of this, and there is a need for one. Okay.
Thank you very
Thank
much,
you.
Dr. Ghareeb.